Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critical Conversations, where we talk about hot topic issues related to American Muslims and other targeted communities. Today we will talk about how white supremacist groups have used the internet and social media to perpetuate their ideologies, and also the challenges that are inherent in curbing online hate and harassment. Joining us in our studio today, we have Dr. Whitney Phillips. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. She is also the author of a three-part ethnographic report called The Oxygen of Amplification: Better Practices for Reporting on Extremists, Antagonists, and Manipulators Online. Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. And so, we'll sort of begin by this trend, very disturbing trend that we're seeing these days, where white supremacist violence is on the rise, and not just here in the US, but around the globe. So could you sort of begin by talking about how the internet and social media platforms provide safe spaces for some of these perpetrators of white supremacist violence who have radicalized online, and how does the internet then provide that safe space to cultivate hate?
Every conversation begins with a deep sigh. The internet, the last book that I wrote, The Ambivalent Internet, so that's sort of a spoiler alert from what I'm about to say, but the internet is a fundamentally ambivalent space where it allows people to connect with each other and share interests and be creative and generate community. And that's as true for activists and other sort of progressives as it is for white supremacists. So the internet provides a space for everybody, or at least potentially it could, those who have access to it. But the thing that the internet does that has become particularly problematic and very pressing of late is that it tends to, although it allows for lots of different kinds of people to interact, it incentivizes, it rewards, it floats to the top the most outrageous, extremist, offensive content. And that's a boon for people on the far right who benefit from all kinds of policies on social media platforms that, again, allow for other kinds of voices to exist, but those platforms don't prop up voices on the left in the way they do voices on the right. And so you have these spaces that allow people to congregate, but they're just floated because of algorithmic docenting, as I like to call it, so the way that algorithms kind of direct your site online. Those algorithms are not directing people to sort of thoughtful pieces about diversity and inclusion. That's not where they're sending people. They're sending people to more reactionary spaces. So for reactionaries, they really have been the beneficiaries of how these social media sites were set up to work. It's not to say that the people who created these sites were looking to create white supremacist havens, but that was the result. And so you can't talk about the rise of white supremacy online without talking about the platforms that people use, and specifically how those platforms have been essentially optimized for the most abusive, harassing, bigoted sort of content.
Right, and so you said, those the most reactionary platforms, or the most reactionary or offensive statements are the ones that sort of garner the most, is it the most response that gets them to the top of the sort of, when we're browsing through like a particular subject or a particular topic, what is it that allows that very divisive content to come up as the first thing that we see on the internet?
Actually, on Twitter the other day, Ezra Klein, the political commentator, pundit,
yes,
I think that would be the framing, yeah, sure. But he was talking on Twitter about how it's not just that Facebook allows lies and disinformation to flourish online. They do, of course. Yeah. But the biggest issue is that Facebook was designed to optimize inspiration and offensiveness. And it just so happens that offensiveness is even more appealing, or it is even more reactable than inspirational content. And so it's not just the case that offensive content appeals to reactionaries, because reactionaries are only part of the conversation. Reactionaries can only carry their messages so far. And so what happens online is that people will see these messages, a certain percentage will be attracted to them, will believe in them, will want to throw their weight behind them.
Yeah.
But they also travel because lots of people who are repulsed by that ideology, they respond too. But they respond to condemn it, they respond to comment, they respond to try and talk sense into people who believe it. And although those motivations are very, very different, it still feeds the algorithms. Algorithms don't care. They don't care what your motives are for sharing. They care that you are sharing. And so the things that get the most response, those are going to float to the top. And that's what these platforms were designed to do, is to float the most popular content. I mean, it is basically a cultural upvoting system that they have. So you have a certain percentage of people, they're doing really reactionary, violent things, but then you have everybody else reacting to them.
Sure.
And then you add journalism into the mix. Journalists are then responding to the worst content and writing stories about the stories that are being written about the stories.
Right.
And you can see how the most offensive content, even if that doesn't represent the majority of people's perspectives, it ends up taking up the lion's share of the space.
Right, absolutely. And so the dangers of internet hate speech, though, then again, are not just confined to the online world, and a lot of times it sort of spills over from the virtual world to our real world. And you've specifically sort of mentioned the mosque attack that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand earlier this year, and you said that that act was steeped in mimetic culture. And I was wondering, for the benefit of our audience, if you could sort of describe what mimetic culture is and how that applies to that specific act of violence.
It's such a big answer, so I'll do my best.
Take your time.
Yes. So meme culture, as we understand it, can be traced back to 4chan, which was a image board that emerged and was popularized in the early mid-2000s. And that was what I studied in my dissertation and ultimately my first book. And it was a problematic space. I mean, that's an understatement. It was a hotbed of racism and sexism and bigotry, all kinds of bigotry. And it was sort of undertaken with kind of a wink, like a trollish wink. That was where, self-identifying trolls really first emerged. Is not that the word troll, it gets so complicated. Not that the word troll first emerged on that site, but that was where it was popularized and adopted as a first-person point of identification. And so trolls on 4chan, they essentially popularized a certain style, a certain aesthetic. And as trolling on 4chan became more and more mainstreamed through the process of journalistic amplification, because that was always happening from the very beginning, what was originally fringe behavior became more and more normalized and popularized to the point that trolling subculture became popular culture that few people knew in 2011 when this mainstreaming process was really starting to take hold. Few people knew that many of the memes that they were sharing that seemed family friendly, advice animals and other things that was generally G-rated, it had its origins, if not directly, then at least indirectly, aesthetically, in this trolling space. And so what happened is that trolling culture, meme culture became, and the sort of associated aesthetic, the lulzy, winky, just trolling kind of excuse, that became a normalized part of many people, certainly people of a certain age, millennials and younger. It became a normalized kind of mode of being online. That was what the internet was like. And if you took the things you saw seriously, you didn't know how to internet. And so what I started encountering in 2015 is that you start to, and it's how trolling crystallized into white supremacy is its own conversation, but the sort of baseline is that happened. And as that happened, journalists who were watching it, they thought it was the same jokiness they had been observing the whole time. They thought it was the same funny, trolly stuff that they had played with themselves in many cases when they were in high school. So they saw all these swastikas, they saw all of this offensive stuff, and their knee-jerk response was to laugh. They didn't know that those spaces were in the process of being hollowed out and filled with actual white supremacists. And so that culture and the kind of the bias that became associated with meme culture was front and center in the Christchurch, in that manifesto. And so the shooter, they were actively, deliberately, well, I mean, I don't speculate about the inner lives of people who engage in that kind of behavior, but one can only assume that this was on purpose because the manifesto was chock full of those kinds of mimetic references. In many cases, those jokes went back all the way to 2007, 2006. They were that old. And the reason, presumably, I mean, one has to assume that there was an understanding that journalists would not be able to turn down a story that had such a strong mimetic element, because it took what already was a horrific action, already had lots of, it was already a profound story to tell, but you throw memes into the mix, and journalists can't help themselves in many cases. And so then it became this conversation about, it's the first meme mass shooting, and that was false, because it wasn't, the memes weren't the lead of the story, but in many stories that was, you know, it became the story. And that was a story that was really 10 years in the making. It wasn't like this was a new thing. That shooter was recycling a lot of these memes that had become normalized over time and weaponized in all these complex ways. And so then, you know, the news narrative writes itself.
So could you give an example of like some of the memes that he might have used that might have seemed somewhat, you know, harmless?
Oh, by the time they ended up in the manifesto, the context was there was no way that you could have framed them as being harmless. But they started out in these trolling spaces as being jokes, being memes, being sort of winky references. And only until, it wasn't until 2015 was the first time. So part of this backstory is that from 2006, 2007, up to about 2015, every time there was a mass shooting, there would be the big joke on 4chan was you would try to trick journalists into thinking that the shooter had posted to 4chan. So they would Photoshop images that made it look like the person was going to 4chan, bragging about they're about to do whatever thing, and it was always a hoax. Every time it happened, you would, me and the few of us who have been doing this work for too long, journalists would come to us, and they would basically be bringing us the same story over and over, and every time we would say, hey, remember, we had this conversation a year ago, hey, remember, here's some links, this is exactly what they did before, this is exactly what they did before. And it wasn't until 2015 was when it turned initially, 2017 was when it became entrenched, that life started imitating the meme. And now, suddenly, because the space had crystallized in these ways, you know, shooters were posting to 4chan and 8chan first. And so then that became the lead of all these stories of mass shooters, but it had always been a joke. And so what the Christchurch shooter was doing was essentially winking at that legacy, which at that point was about 10 years old. And so for those of us who have been following it, it was like the most grotesque sort of full circle that you could imagine.
Wow. That's crazy. In your publication, The Oxygen of Amplification, you do outline the inherent dangers of reporting offensive memes and sort of bringing attention to bigoted internet personalities. So what do you think, I mean, our responsibility as social media users, as internet users, regular people, what is our role in sort of perpetuating some of this, and what should we be careful about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for many people, the assumption is that if you're not actively setting out to cause harm, then you're not harmful. That we tend to really privilege the criterion of harm as being sort of, that's the ethical line. I'm not trying to, I reject and repudiate white supremacists, right? And so anything I say or do, of course, I'm not going to be contributing to white supremacy. But the thing that we all need to understand, and this is true for me, it's true for everybody, is that we never stand outside of the story we're commenting on. We are always ourselves part of that story, and that's something that journalists in particular, and many people are changing their approach to this because the problems are so inescapable now. But certainly before Charlottesville, there was a lot of resistance to the idea that journalists were contributing to the outcomes as much as the bad actors were. But the fact is, with journalists, by engaging with the story, they are ensuring that the story lives that much longer. I mean, the thing about reactionaries, they're dangerous in unique ways. They are violent in unique ways. But there also are not very many of them in comparison to everybody else.
Right.
So they rely on the signal boosting power of everyday people, but particularly journalists. That is how they get their message. I mean, you can have a message that pings around in the far-right ecosystem, but it's not gonna really penetrate the mainstream consciousness until it's reported by the New York Times. And they know that, and they have been exploiting that relation. They know this better than anybody.
Sure.
And in that report, that was what I was highlighting. I was only calling attention to something that they've known from the very beginning, and is a relationship that I first started tracking in 2008.
Wow.
And so, again, you know, when you have some time on this particular beat, the same patterns, they just unfold. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's just that the stakes keep getting raised exponentially. I mean, in 2008, it was jokes about, you know, scatological sort of silly things, but it was the same mechanism. You trick a person in a position of authority or someone from a mainstream publication to promote and amplify some ridiculous claim. And it seems it could be, for some observers, somewhat funny to watch that when the thing being amplified is not itself inherently dangerous.
Right.
But basically where we are in 2019 is you have people who have 10 years worth of, you know, research and development on their side.
Right.
And that makes them extremely capable of this kind of media manipulation.
Right, but I mean, what's that mean for, you know, activists who are trying to sort of denounce white supremacist violence and everything that sort of comes with that, you know, that space? And so a lot of people, like, you know, on their social media platforms use that to sort of, you know, voice their own opinions, people in the mainstream, well-meaning people. So what are you saying, that they should not then share certain things, even, you know, sort of with their own sort of take on that particular meme or that particular offensive whatever?
It's such a tricky line, and I'm reluctant to say definitely one way or the other. No, people should not comment, because sometimes you can't be silent.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes behavior warrants a strong, unequivocal pushback, and to not do that would be to signal complicity.
Right.
So it's not that not responding is the answer. It's how do you respond in a strategic way?
Yeah.
And the biggest trick there is trying to figure out who benefits from the amplification. I mean, who are you feeding, essentially, and who is being harmed as a result? And we tend not to ask that question in exactly that way. In certain cases, there could be ways of, you know, one of the things that I often will advocate for, but again, you can't universalize, you can't say always do this, but often one of the things that helps is to shift where the camera is pointing, because many times people have internalized this idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that if you call attention to bigotry, that's going to dissipate bigotry.
Right.
Which is an idea that has not super duper been borne out, because it still is here.
Right.
If that were effective, then people writing all the articles about the alt-right in 2016 would have made that go away, and that is not how it works. But I understand the impulse of, we have to call attention to the ugly thing so that we can deal with it, so we know what we're The problem, though, is that still centered in that narrative is the bad actor.
Right.
They're the center of the story, and the whole world, everything revolves around them.
Yeah.
And if you can shift the camera to capture the experiences of people impacted by white supremacy, that is an important first step. I mean, there's also some ambivalence there, because you don't want to just turn the camera around and show people of color, for example, just as victims. Because then they still don't have the inner subjectivity that makes them individual people. That it's not about showing someone's pain. It's about allowing that person to be a person.
Absolutely.
And that often, you know, runs counter to many sort of journalistic norms of, you know, getting a hot take, you know, getting an overview, telling just the facts, right? Like accessing someone's inner subjective experience doesn't fit within that model. And so I think that we need to rethink, you know, what some of our journalistic norms should be so that we can amplify something that could be beneficial to public discourse as opposed to straight up destructive.
Absolutely. And so, you know, it's one thing to sort of not cover and not focus on the bigoted, your regular bigoted internet personalities, but it's quite another when one of those personalities is the President of the United States. And if they, as we see in our current president, like, you know, if they are constantly tweeting and using social media to sort of perpetuate bigotry or racist, you know, sort of sending out racist tweets, or in, you know, Donald Trump's case a couple of years ago when he retweeted anti-Muslim videos that were originated in some, you know, far-right British organization, and that also had implications, of course, for communities of color. What is the responsibility then of journalists? I mean, this is the president. You do have to sort of cover what he's talking about, the sort of the trends that he's setting. How do you avoid not covering that?
I mean, first of all, hire more people of color. I mean, number one, that is the number one rule, because there is the story itself, the individual article that's written. And then there's the broader media narrative and the framing that goes along with that. And there are things you can do within a story and a broader framing to shift where the camera is pointed. But part of the reason that journalists tend to miss so much is that in large national news outlets, most of the certainly staff writers are white men. No offense to white men, but the problem there is that the perspective is going to be pretty limited. If you think about, so in my classes, regardless of what I'm teaching, I always start the class off by having the students stand around in a circle and put their hands over their eyes, and I have them describe the room. I am, you know, of course, standing across some number of students, and I do a little dance, and I ask them to describe what they see. They can see what I'm doing, but the students sitting right next to me can't, because their peripheral vision is blocked. And I use that as a way of underscoring everybody is positioned in the world because of all kinds of things, intersectional identity categories. And that you see what you see, but there are other ways that you could see things. And if you have 89% of the people in your newsroom looking through the same pair of goggles, they're going to see the same story over and over and over. And so the response to what do we do about a President Trump, it's understanding that diversity and efforts to bring in multiple kinds of perspectives, that's not just like a nice talking point. That is literally how we get closer to the truth. And if we don't have those perspectives, we're going to miss important information. And in the process of doing that, you end up endangering significant subsets of the population who are not reflected in that storytelling, or who are dehumanized through that storytelling, or who are simply ignored.
So, I mean, would you recommend, like, until that happens, until you have that, you know, sort of that number of, you know, a very like sort of diverse journalistic world? I mean, would you rather that journalist, I mean, when every time he retweets or tweets something that's offensive, to just not cover that? Because I also feel that there is a huge amount of sort of space given to, I mean, the most sensationalized his tweets are, the more time that's given in the evening news around those discussions, and perhaps just disproportionate amount of.
Oh, I mean, presidential tweets. We are living in such a strange moment. The fact that it's a discussion as to whether or not you should give attention to what the president says in itself. I mean, it just is. Surreal. It's surreal. So, I mean, when he did his go back tweets over the summer, you know, those were tweets that you couldn't not respond to because it was so egregious. And that was a case where if you hadn't responded to it, that would have signaled complicity. Like, that would have been okay behavior. But what was missing, the failure there, was that the majority of the responses, particularly from white journalists, it became a conversation of, well, how well is this going to play in the Midwest? Rather than thinking about when you are, again, with the sunlight disinfects issue, when you are repeating his tweet, showing it on the screen over and over, when you're showing the crowd chant, send her back,
right,
over and over and over, that might not do anything to a white audience member who is not personally threatened by that kind of, but that's wounding. It's re-wounding over and over. And it further normalizes that kind of discourse. So that sort of reporting, although sometimes you have to respond to the thing that he says, there seems to still be a lack of reflection on how does our reporting change the conditions on the ground for people of color, for the people who are
subjected to that.
Right, exactly. And so being more sensitive to that and really foregrounding this reporting isn't outside of the story, it's part of the story. It has effects in people's lives. And if that meta-narrative were more foregrounded, it's still bizarre and vexing and heartbreaking and weird and exhausting. It's still all of those things. But at least it is conscientious of the overall network circumstance that we find ourselves in. And I think that kind of meta-reflective modeling then becomes something that audience members can reflect in their own behavior. That becomes exactly that, a model for how you can better respond to content that you encounter. Think about what are the chains of amplification and what specific role am I playing?
Sure, absolutely. That's very helpful. According to the ADL, 59% of Americans believe that online hate and harassment makes hate crimes more common. Do you agree with those Americans? And also, can you talk a little bit about how the U.S. has attempted to regulate online hate speech? And is there anything that we can learn from other countries and how they've sort of tackled this question?
Again, so many deep sighs. I mean, just looking around, it is, you can't deny that hate crime is on the rise. Statistically, it's on the rise. I mean, it just is. And I have no doubt that the emboldening of those kinds of positions, the fact that social media has created such a haven for white supremacists, that is affirming of that identity. It amplifies the ideology so that more people are attracted to it. And, the fact of the matter is that people don't get turned into white supremacists by going onto the internet. People with white supremacist leanings are able to find their niche in the world thanks to internet, thanks to networking technology. So radicalization is an issue of algorithms, of all kinds of things, but radicalization is also something you bring to the table. So there's never a clear demarcation between what happens online and what happens offline to begin with. So if you already have those leanings, you're going to find your people and you will be reinforced in your beliefs and incentivized in some cases for those beliefs. So then, of course, the osmosis goes in the other direction too. And so then you're emboldened in your beliefs online. And so then, certain words or certain kinds of actions, which may have been more taboo, certainly were felt and acted upon years ago, but weren't so centralized to public discourse, then it is more normalized. And that's why you see across college campuses a host of problems related to the expression of white supremacist violence and hate that certainly existed in some pockets 5 or 10 years ago, but it didn't have the same kind of cultural cachet that it does now. And I think that social media really has played an enormous role in helping normalize that. And so has the people who occupy political positions. And to the second part of that question, what have we done? I mean, we haven't done enough. Certainly social media companies haven't done enough, and government regulatory agencies haven't done enough to enforce what social media companies can do. So social media companies can make their own choices, but if you've got a government agency saying you have to meet certain criteria, that would change the dynamic. That's not happened. And the reason it hasn't happened in either sector in terms of sort of governmental regulation and then also within the companies themselves is that there's such a tight grasp on ideas of free speech, assumptions about what free speech is and means and does and should do, even if you're not talking specifically about constitutional issues, because what Facebook does is not a First Amendment issue, but it still is ideologically sort of the idea that people should be allowed to say whatever they want without any kind of interference. That commitment to that ideal is really the hindrance to having conversations about, well, how might governments, regulatory agencies work with social media companies to actually work towards the goal, ostensibly, of free speech, which is to empower the most amount of speech for the most amount of people. That's the robust understanding of free speech that gets lost in these conversations about, well, we can't do anything about disinformation. We can't silence any white supremacists because then free speech? It's like, yeah, but who's not speaking as a result? And so until we start rethinking, reorienting culturally to ideals of free speech, I don't know how far we're going to get.
Wow, well, on that dismal note, but thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for your time. I wish we could go on. You gave us so much to think about, but thank you so much for being here. Until next time, this is your host, Mehlaka Samdani.